Last night's episode of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert erupted into one of the most electrifying showdowns in late-night television history. A clash so raw and unscripted that it left viewers, both in the studio and at home, reeling. What began as a routine night of satirical jabs and polished banter spiraled into a fiery confrontation that exposed the fault lines of a polarized nation, pitting a seasoned comedian against a freshly minted political titan. The stage was set innocently enough. Stephen Colbert stationed behind his desk, his trademark sly grin cutting through the warm glow of the Ed Sullivan Theater's lights, the house band riffing through their jazzy interlude as the audience roared with anticipation. The night's guest, Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General who just days earlier had been sworn in as Attorney General in President Donald Trump's 2025 administration, a third term that had already ignited fierce debate across the country. From the moment her name boomed through the speakers, a restless hum rippled through the crowd, a mix of excitement and unease that hinted at the storm to come. Bondi's appointment had been a lightning rod from the start. Critics online and in the press had wasted no time dissecting her record, her unwavering loyalty to Trump during his earlier legal battles, her controversial tenure in Florida, marked by accusations of favoritism, now her sudden elevation to one of the most powerful legal positions in the nation. Social media had been ablaze for days with hashtags like Bondi bias and Trump justice, while op-eds in major outlets questioned whether her appointment signaled a new era of politicized law enforcement. Supporters, meanwhile, hailed her as a fierce patriot, a no-nonsense enforcer, ready to deliver on Trump's promises. The stakes were high, the tension palpable, but no one, not the audience, not the crew, and certainly not Colbert himself, could have predicted the live-wire spectacle that would unfold over the next hour. The show opened with its usual rhythm. Colbert strode out to a swell of applause, his navy suit crisp, his glasses glinting under the studio lights as he launched into his monologue. He riffed on Trump's improbable third campaign, a chaotic, nostalgia-fueled run that had defied pundits and polls alike, tossing in quips about the president's latest golf course boasts and the cabinet's revolving door of loyalists. The audience lapped it up, their laughter a familiar soundtrack to Colbert's razor-sharp delivery. Then came the pivot. But tonight, folks, we've got a real She's fresh off her swearing in, ready to uphold the law, or at least some very specific campaign promises. Please welcome the new Attorney General of the United States, Pam Bondi. The crowd's reaction was a jagged mix. Cheers from a smattering of supporters, polite claps from the curious, and a low murmur of dissent from skeptics. It was clear this wouldn't be a softball interview. Bondi emerged from behind the iconic blue curtain, her presence commanding despite the charged atmosphere. She wore a tailored red blazer that seemed to radiate defiance, paired with a cream blouse and a string of pearls that caught the light as she crossed the stage. Her blonde hair was swept back in a sleek, no-nonsense style, and her posture, shoulders squared, chin lifted, projected the steely confidence of someone who'd just been handed the keys to the Justice Department. She shook Colbert's hand with a firm grip, flashed a tight smile and settled into the guest chair, crossing her legs with the poise of a seasoned litigator. For a fleeting moment, it felt like business as usual, a high-profile guest, a late-night host, and an audience primed for entertainment. The pleasantries lasted all of 5 minutes before the air thickened with tension, the first crackle of what would soon become a full-blown tempest. Colbert leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk, his grin widening as he eased into the interview. "So, Pam," he began, his tone light and teasing. "Congratulations on the new gig. Attorney General, it's a big step up from Florida. I mean, one day you're chasing alligators, the next you're wrangling Trump's legal posse. How's the transition going?" The audience chuckled, a warm ripple of amusement that Bondi met with a practiced laugh of her own. "It's an honor to serve," she replied smoothly, her voice steady and measured. "The American people spoke loud and clear in November, and I'm here to deliver justice. Real justice for them, not the coastal elites who think they know better." It was a rehearsed line, one she'd likely honed on the campaign trail, and it drew a smattering of applause from her supporters in the crowd. Colbert nodded, letting the moment hang before diving deeper. "Right, justice," he said, tilting his head with a mock-innocent smile that barely masked the glint in his eye. "Speaking of which, I think the audience and maybe a few federal judges have one big question. Is it true you sent a memo to your staff titled Operation MAGA Justice, outlining plans to fast-track pardons for Trump allies, only to accidentally CC a reporter from the Miami Herald? The question landed like a grenade, its fuse already lit. The audience gasped, a few nervous laughs breaking the stunned silence as heads swiveled toward Bondi. Her eyes narrowed, her lips tightening into a thin line, as if the words had tripped a hidden wire deep within her. "That's absurd," she fired back. Her voice clipped and edged with indignation. "You're peddling nonsense cooked up by some left-wing hack with an agenda. I expected better from you, Stephen. Not this tabloid trash." Her tone was sharp, her words a calculated jab meant to put him on the defensive. But Colbert didn't flinch. He'd faced tougher opponents, and he'd clearly come prepared. "Oh, I've got the email right here," he said, reaching under his desk with theatrical flair and pulling out a manila folder emblazoned with the DOJ seal, or at least a convincing prop version of it. He waved it briefly, letting the audience catch a glimpse before setting it down with a deliberate thud. "I won't read it verbatim. Lawyers might sue me, and I'm pretty sure my insurance doesn't cover Attorney General wrath. But I will say this, when your subject line reads priority, loyalty pardons, and it's sent from an official DOJ account to a journalist, maybe you're not the person to be guarding America's scales of justice." The crowd erupted, a chaotic blend of laughter and shock that rolled through the theater like a wave. The mood had shifted, the usual late-night levity giving way to a sharpness that cut deeper than anyone had anticipated. Bondi's face hardened, her hands gripping the arms of her chair as if anchoring herself against the rising tide. "That's a fabrication," she snapped, leaning forward, her voice rising with barely contained fury. "This is why people don't trust the media. Elitists like you twisting facts for cheap applause. There's no memo, no leak, no Operation MAGA Justice. You're making it up." Her denial was fierce, her eyes locked on Colbert as if daring him to push further. The audience quieted, sensing the stakes climbing with every word. Colbert leaned back in his chair, unfazed, his fingers steepled as he studied her. "So you're saying the Justice Department didn't have to issue a retraction last week after a memo about preemptive legal shields for certain unnamed patriots leaked to the press?" he asked, his tone calm but laced with a challenge that hung heavy in the air. "Because that's a very specific fabrication, Pam, one that somehow made it to the Washington Post, CNN, and even Fox News, who, let's be honest, aren't exactly in the tank for me." He paused, letting the names of the outlets sink in, each one a pinprick in her armor. "I'm not here to play your game, Stephen," Bondi shot back, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and exasperation. "The American people chose this administration because they're sick of smug gatekeepers like you undermining our justice system for rating. You're not a journalist, you're a performer." The accusation landed with a thud, a direct hit meant to discredit him in front of his own audience. A few boos rose from the crowd, quickly drowned out by cheers from her defenders, the room splitting into factions as the tension boiled over. "Oh, absolutely," Colbert replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he leaned forward again, closing the distance between them. "Because nothing screams justice like accidentally emailing a pardon wish list to a newsroom while CCing your Pilates instructor." The line was a dagger, delivered with perfect timing, and the audience howled, their laughter edged with disbelief. The exchange had morphed into something raw, no longer just banter, but a public unraveling that neither side seemed willing to back away from. Bondi's face flushed, a deep crimson creeping up her neck as her composure began to crack. She uncrossed her legs, planting both feet firmly on the floor as if readying herself for battle. "Let me ask you something, Stephen," she said, jabbing a finger toward him, her voice cutting through the noise. "What qualifies you to lecture me on law and order? You sit there cracking jokes, hiding behind your little desk while real patriots fight for this country. You've never prosecuted a case, never stood in a courtroom, never faced the hard choices I've made. What gives you the right?" Her words were a salvo, an attempt to flip the script and put him on trial instead. The audience grew hushed, the weight of her challenge settling over the room. Colbert didn't hesitate. He paused, folding his hands on his desk, his voice dropping to a quiet, deliberate cadence that carried more force than any shout. "I don't have to be a prosecutor to know that leaking sensitive legal strategies to the press is reckless," he said, each word measured and precise, I don't need a law degree to see the difference between upholding justice and turning it into a loyalty racket. And I don't need to wear a red blazer to understand that when you're caught with your hand in the cookie jar, or in this case, the pardon jar, you don't get to blame the baker. The room grew still, the audience hanging on his every syllable, as the gravity of his response sank in. It wasn't a punchline, it was an indictment delivered with the calm authority of someone who'd seen through the bluster. The Bondi's eyes flashed, her breath quickening as she struggled to regain her footing. "Those leaks are fake," she retorted, her voice trembling with fury. "You're pushing lies because you can't stand that Trump's back, and that I'm here to clean up the mess your side left. You're scared of what we represent, so you invent scandals to tear us down." Her hands clenched into fists, her knuckles whitening as she leaned further forward, her whole body radiating defiance. "No, Pam," Colbert said coolly, his gaze unwavering as he met her intensity head-on. "What I can't stand is someone in your position treating the Justice Department like a personal favor factory. You think the rule of law is a campaign promise you can rewrite on the fly. Vote for us and we'll pardon your buddies. That's not justice. That's a transaction." The audience hushed, the levity draining from the room as his words landed, with a quiet, piercing clarity. For a moment, it felt less like a late-night show and more like a courtroom, with Colbert as the prosecutor and Bondi as the defendant scrambling to mount a defense. She faltered. Just for a split second, a flicker of doubt in her eyes, before doubling down with renewed venom. "You sit in your cushy studio, far from the courtroom, far from the real world, and call yourself a patriot?" She spat, her voice rising to a near shout. "You're a late-night jester, Stephen. Nothing more. You mock people like me because you're afraid of what we're building. A stronger, safer America." Her words were a rallying cry, a desperate appeal to her base, but they rang hollow against the mounting evidence Colbert had laid bare. And yet he cut in, his voice slicing through her tirade like a blade. "I've never accidentally broadcast a get-out-of-jail-free plan to a reporter while hyping mega justice." "Explain that, Pam." The question hung in the air, unanswerable and damning, as the audience erupted into gasps and scattered applause. The camera panned briefly to Jean-Baptiste at the piano, his jaw slack, his fingers hovering over the keys as if even the band didn't know how to score this chaos. The theater vibrated with energy, every eye fixed on the two figures locked in their verbal duel. Bondi bolted upright, smoothing her blazer with shaking hands as if clinging to the last scraps of her dignity. "This is a sham," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You're a sham? I came here for a discussion, not a smear campaign built on fiction." Her breath was audible through her mic, ragged and uneven, as she glared at Colbert with a fury that seemed to burn through the lens. "Then maybe you should have saved the fiction for your staff emails," Colbert murmured, his tone dry and cutting, drawing a fresh wave of gasps from the crowd. It was the final blow, a quiet mic drop that left no room for rebuttal. Bondi froze, her eyes locked on his, her chest rising and falling as the weight of the moment crashed over her. For a heartbeat, it seemed she might lunge across the desk or storm off in a blaze of defiance. Then, with a sharp exhale, she turned on her heel and marched off stage, the clack of her heels echoing like gunfire in the stunned silence. No goodbye, no wave, just a furious exit as she vanished behind the curtain, leaving the audience gaping and the crew scrambling to regain control. Colbert sat back, unfazed, staring into the camera with a faint smirk. "We'll be right back," he said, his voice steady as the band stumbled into a shaky outro. Jean-Baptiste hammering out a discordant chord that mirrored the disarray. The screen faded to black, but the reverberations of what had just happened lingered. A seismic moment that transcended the usual boundaries of late-night TV. This wasn't just a segment break, it was a reckoning. A collision of comedy and power that had stripped away the polish and exposed something raw underneath.